Hello, and welcome to another Joe and Kat Chats. Today we're talking about colorism,
Yes, ma'am.
and we're both looking forward to this topic. How are you, Joe?
Catherine Wells, I am on fire today. I'm feeling excellent. It's been a wonderful day. It's been a wonderful Tuesday. And speaking of colorism, I want to make sure that everybody understands how we're going to set the tone for this meeting regarding colorism, okay? Now, if you take a look at back, and I'm going to tilt the camera back a little bit here, okay? This is none other than young Michael Jackson. Young Michael Jackson, all right? This is Michael Jackson when he looked like a Black person. But then if you look at Michael Jackson towards the later years, towards the Bad album and the Dangerous album, and then up until his untimely death 11 years ago, he ended up looking more like you than more like me. And when we talk about colorism, colorism is a form of discrimination, okay, where lighter skinned people receive more preferential treatment than darker skinned people. Now, take a look at what we're going to look at here. Mike, okay? When Mike was this, yeah, he was getting accepted. You know, maybe people knew he could dance and sing with his brothers, and then, you know, his sister Janet, who is one of the 5 greatest artists ever in the pop music era. But if you notice that when Michael started getting more lighter skinned, okay, he started getting accepted more by quote unquote white America and the rest of the world. That actually happened. So when he went from the Off the Wall album in 1979, which is actually really my favorite Michael Jackson album, and then he came out with Thriller, the hair had a little more Jerry curl juice in it and became a bit more straight. The nose became a bit more pointy instead of wider and flat like this nose was. And then the Bad album came out, and it was like, okay, whoa. Michael Jackson went from being dark chocolate like me to being coffee with milk. And then the Dangerous album came out in 1991, which is hard to believe that was almost 30 years ago. And then Mike was like, well, wait a minute, how does Mike look like his sister LaToya? What the hell happened? So colorism has played a role, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to wear this shirt, is because we've seen colorism in pop culture, but we don't always necessarily see colorism on a day-to-day basis, and we may not necessarily recognize it when it is blatantly flagrant and apparent. So we want to make sure that we talk about colorism and why it exists, and it's a form of preferential treatment between darker skinned people and lighter skinned people. And that sort of preferential treatment typically happens intra-racially. Not necessarily interracially, but we'll talk about that later on, but intra-racially. Now, the term came from an Alice Walker book, and the name of the book was In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And I'm going to read this from my notes. And she says she defined colorism as prejudicial or preferential treatment of the same race people based solely on their skin color, which is fascinating. Now, colorism also has another terminology that's attached to it. It's also called shadism. It's also called shadism. And when we talk about shadism, I feel shadism is probably more of an accurate terminology than colorism.
Okay.
I'm
curious to know why.
I feel it's a bit more accurate because when you talk about shadism and shadism seems more accurate because with colorism, skin color is irrefutable. It's like you look at somebody, it's like, okay, well, yo, all right, he's Black. Okay, well, she is white. There's no real nuance with that. Okay, I'm a brother, you're a white lady. That's kind of it. And racism becomes easier when the skin color is, I guess, more easily distinguishable. But with shadism seems more accurate with regards to what we were talking about today, because the discrimination is intraracial and in some cases interracial. Shadism plays into that mantra of whiteness as being the paragon of virtue, or white is right. And as a result, therefore, if somebody is closer to whiteness, the greater the likelihood of upward mobility and social acceptance. The shadism, I guess, more accurately defines the nuance of what we are discussing today rather than colorism. Because
Yeah.
if you just have a box of Crayola crayons, you know, you get your old school basic box of 8 or 16. If you had a little more allowance money, you might have been able to splurge for the 24 or the 48 color box with the pencil, with the sharpener in the back. But with the 48 color box, there's more shades of colors in them. There's a
Mm-hmm.
wider palette of colors that are available for you to color with. But with that box of 8 crayons, it's your basic red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, and white. That's it. That's what you're getting. And it's easy to distinguish those colors. But that's not really shades. They're just distinct colors. And when you
Right.
talk about the distinct colors of Black people, or the distinct colors of people in general based upon racial categorization,
Mm-hmm.
categorization. You talk about Black people and white people and Native Americans and Native Hawaiians and Asians and Latinos, or Latinx, as we like to say now. There's, when you talk about specifically within the African American diaspora, there are different shades and different hues of Black people. And there's a historical legacy of slavery that plays into this, where it's more than just simple skin color.
Yeah.
Because Black people in the United States historically, regardless if you're light skinned, like my daughter who's actually biracial, or if you're a little bit darker like me, like chocolate brown color like myself, my daughter is going to get looked at as a darker skinned person, as Black. And then all of the cultural and social implications that are going to be attached that come with that. But but within the community, the Black community, it's like, okay, well, hey, you're lighter skinned, you're darker skinned. Okay, there's more like, you're more likely to have success or more opportunities because you're light skinned rather than dark skinned. So the discrimination, again, from a white person looking at a lighter skinned Black person or a dark skinned Black person, there is an obvious interracial
Mm-hmm.
discrimination. But within Black people, within the Black or African American diaspora, lighter skin and darker skin, that discrimination is intraracial. And
Yeah.
you don't get that sort of nuance strictly based with the term colorism, but you get it, at least in my opinion, with the term shadeism.
I love that. That was a lot. And I hadn't actually thought about it in that, through that lens before. So I really appreciate your perspective on it.
Of course.
When I was sort of looking into this topic for today, I saw that colorism and shadeism were used sort of interchangeably, or both. Like if they use the word colorism, they would say, in other words, shadeism,
Right.
etc. But
Mhm.
one thing I did find was that shadism is usually used to discuss relation to society's beauty standards. And that was the only sort of specific part of shadism that I saw that in sort of the articles I was reading
Mhm.
that distinguished it outside of the word colorism.
Sure.
But I totally appreciate your perspective, because I think that's totally accurate, because color is also a term that's becoming outdated because it has racial implications, because we can't call folks in the
Color.
BIPOC community, colored. Like,
Exactly.
that's super outdated, and it has a lot of racial history, racist history, I should say.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so I think that that's absolutely something that we need to continue this conversation with. And from
Absolutely.
now on, use the word shadeism, because, language grows and changes, and as do we
Absolutely.
with our intellect and our understandings and knowledge. So,
Exactly.
yeah, that's a great opening sort of perspective. So thank you.
You're welcome. And by the way, information changes situations, and kind of to go with the whole colorism situation and Michael Jackson. And I literally thought of this about 12 seconds ago. Years ago, there was a rapper named, I think it was Twista, and Jamie Foxx had a song, um, and Kanye West was on the song too. And one of the lines that Kanye West had in the song, and it relates to Michael Jackson, he said, "Got a light-skinned friend who looks like Michael Jackson. Got a dark-skinned friend looks like Michael Jackson." Okay? And there was just a line in the song, and everybody kind of laughed, like, ha, 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 oh, yeah, it's funny. But if you really think about it, how deep those lyrics actually are, he's maybe not necessarily discussing colorism, but I'm going to apply it in this sense, because think about how much you have to transform your appearance for someone else to say that you've got a light-skinned friend that looks like Michael Jackson, but then a dark-skinned friend that looks like Michael Jackson. Think about how much physical appearance and transformation you had to go from a dark-skinned looking person who looks like Michael Jackson to a light-skinned person that looks like Michael Jackson. That exactly plays into everything we're talking about with colorism today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And the song was good too. It was a great song.
Fair.
Jamie Foxx on the hook. Yeah, big tune.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's an interesting concept because yeah, a lot of the times it's framed as sort of this colorism is intergroup fighting, almost like like the discrimination is framed as, or prejudice is framed as sort of like, well, this particular group of people is like prejudiced against their own people. But I think that the more important conversation that's going to come to light today is how actually colonialism has impacted and perpetuated this idea of whiteness being the best in all of the world. And so it's like you said, it's both inter and intra
racial, exactly.
Yeah, racial biases, and so it's so embedded in our culture and our society. And
Yes.
so it's like it's something that we don't think about as often, or maybe if you've been doing racial justice research, you've probably come across several articles about it. But again, it's just framed as sort of this othering, in the sense that if you're a white person reading about it, it's usually like, oh, well, Black folks have this problem within their community. But like, that's not the case. The shadism is very much alive and well throughout, within communities and among communities,
Exactly. Like I said in my Instagram story earlier on today, I said, we're going to talk about white people and how colorism also is not just within the African-American diaspora. It also affects white people too. There are a couple of instances of colorism that we want to talk about in the white community. But before we go about continuing to talk about that, again, with white people, Black people, BIPOC, etc., colorism and shadism are forms of discrimination. They're forms of racism. So what we want to do is take about a couple of minutes to reiterate and rediscuss what race is, because I think some of us who have watched these videos may not have seen all of the videos where we've talked about race. And race is when you categorize humans based upon physical characteristics or social qualities. It's like, hey, you know what? I am darker skinned. I have certain physical features that categorize me as a Black person. You have certain physical qualities and social characteristics that qualify you as a white person. Now, and again, one of my favorite quotes that I've heard about race comes from a Cornel West speech at the University of Oregon from August of last year, where Cornel West discussed his book, Race Matters. And one of the presenters at the speech was a member of the English department at the University of Oregon named Dr. David Lee. And I'm going to bring this quote up again. He says race is not a thing, but a relationship. Race is biological irrelevance with fatal social consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So again, when we talk about race and when we talk about colorism, not only, and shadism, not only interracially, but intraracially, there are fatal social consequences that happen as a result of these somewhat arbitrary racial human categorizations.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually something that I came across that I liked in a couple of the definitions that I looked into that define colorism. It goes further than the one that you presented earlier from Alice Walker,
Yes.
in the sense that it also includes like that it's a form of prejudice with members of the same race, but are treated differently based on social implications that come
Yes.
from cultural meanings attached to skin color, which I
Mhm.
thought was really crucial in that. So cultural meanings that are attached are so embedded, that they have social implications. And so, yeah, I think that that's a really important point to,
Yeah.
that's really something we talk about often, because fatal social consequences are a real thing.
It's fatal social consequences are a matter, quite honestly, of life and death. That's
Yeah.
the very definition of fatal social consequences. And these fatal social consequences, to bring up a public health term or a medical term, are especially when you're dealing, for example, with some of the police brutality that is taking place, that typically happens with darker skinned Black people as opposed to lighter skinned Black people, or lighter skinned people in general, like white folks. They're what is known as sentinel events, which are defined as life and death events or life and death situations. And the hue of your skin tone could be a matter in some instances, or in many instances, of life and death. And one of the practices that we talk about in terms of intraracial shadeism in the African American community happened many years ago with what's called the brown paper bag test.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the brown paper bag test, again, is a form of discrimination that took place among the Black community, where you would compare a Black person's skin tone relative to the shade of a paper bag. So if a Black person had a skin tone or a complexion that was close to or lighter than a brown paper bag, they were more socially accepted. They had certain rights and privileges that were afforded to them that were not afforded to Black people who had a skin tone that was darker than a brown paper bag. The brown paper bag test created these different levels of social stratification within the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
And you basically had a situation where, oh, well, hey, if you're lighter skinned, you must be considered as a quote unquote better Black person, or more socially acceptable, or more upwardly mobile because you're lighter skinned than someone who is darker skinned. And there is a historical legacy to this that dates all the way back to slavery. So, for example, you had lighter skinned enslaved people who typically worked in the house. They were typically the ones who were taking care of the white people's children. They were doing home chores. They were working inside the house, like washing dishes and washing clothes and cleaning homes. You had darker skinned enslaved people who were typically working in the fields. They were the ones picking cotton and picking vegetables and baling hay and taking care of livestock. And the implications of that were that lighter skinned people had more privilege because, oh, you weren't working in the field sweating your ass off picking tobacco or cotton. You were in the house where it wasn't nearly as warm, and you were able to do these less physically demanding and more menial tasks as a result of simply your complexion. And because you were darker skinned, oh, well, you're working in the field, you have to be out there sweating and doing all of this hard labor every single day. That means you had fewer privileges. That sort of framework came from, I guess, a Eurocentric standard of beauty, where if you're white, then you are the exemplar of what is to be good and what is right and what is and what is white. Historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs for an abbreviation, used the brown paper bag test as a way as an admission. Howard University, which is widely regarded as what is called the Black Harvard, which is in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., they at one point had applicants send in pictures of themselves to make sure that you met a certain skin tone to attend their university.
That is wild.
It happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know about that. What I did know was that that same university, Howard University, has a all-black sorority that used this brown paper bag test, and it sort of became a news story a while ago, several years ago, I think. And
was it Alpha Kappa Alpha?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
we'll discuss Alpha Kappa Alpha later on.
Yeah, totally. And the other thing I wanted to say, just in response to what you were talking about, as far as the history of that's coming from slavery, which comes from a colonial lens as well.
Exactly.
I just wanted to be clear that the light-skinned people that were working in the homes generally were a result of slave masters raping Black women.
Exactly.
And there's a large history that everyone should look into about the hypersexualization of Black women that is still prevalent today.
Yes.
And so I think there is also, an aspect of this that the lighter skinned Black people that were given sort of jobs in the house, which were, like you said, usually less labor intensive than working in the fields. There's also sort of this aspect of, those people being kin of the white slave owners, but still slaves. And that's something we can discuss further as well.
Exactly. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier on. Just because you were lighter skinned, that did not remove the stain of being an enslaved person off of you. You can't, Blackness is not something you take off at night and put on in the morning. You wear it. It's who you are. It is part of your existence. And simply because you are a lighter skinned Black person, that, sure, you might have been more socially accepted by white people, but you were still an enslaved person. And that sort of mindset still kind of plays itself out today. I thought about this last night with basketball, for example. The Golden State Warriors has a player named Steph Curry, and they have another player named Klay Thompson. Now, Klay Thompson is biracial. His dad, Michael Thompson from the Bahamas, first overall pick in the NBA draft, I think in 1978. His mother, Klay Thompson's mother, is a white lady named Julie. Now, Steph Curry's dad is Black guy, Del Curry, played in the NBA for 17 or 18 years. His mom, Sonia, is a light-skinned Black woman. Complexion-wise, if you look at Klay Thompson and Steph Curry, they essentially look quite similar, okay? Yet, Klay Thompson never, at least in my opinion, never really receives any sort of backlash because he's because he's biracial. But Steph Curry, because he has two Black parents, he faces some of the social stratification that comes from being a lighter skinned Black person. It's okay, well, yeah, he's a really good basketball player, but yeah, he grew up privileged because his dad played in the NBA. But then there's also this sort of light skinned privilege that comes attached to Steph Curry because he's a lighter skinned Black person. Yet Klay Thompson, who essentially grew up a similar lifestyle to Steph Curry, with his dad also playing in the NBA and winning a couple of NBA championships with the Lakers. Klay Thompson never really faces that sort of light-skinned backlash because he's biracial. So even within the same basketball team in the same city, with two basketball players that grew up with similar lifestyles of privilege because of their famous NBA fathers, one faces derision because he's a lighter skinned black person. The other is biracial and faces none of that criticism.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, that's a really unique situation that we can use to sort of compare. And I think that is an important point because it really demonstrates how social stratification of Black people in the United States particularly has impacted. It's generationally a thing. Like we talk about this in when we had our episodes on reparations, because Absolutely. I mean, there are so many things that put Black people in these positions of not having any power at all. Correct. For so long, and it's gone on for so many generations that, like, no wonder shadism is still a thing, and these people are like, it's so interesting to compare them because, like, if your parents are both Black, like, they've experienced things like poverty potentially. I mean, maybe not in this case because of the NBA sort of legacy, and like probably didn't actually grow up impoverished, but like there are real life implications to growing up in a Black family versus having someone as your parent, you know, being white. So
it's a real thing. It's a real thing. And another concept of shadism that we want to talk about that's somewhat closely related to all of this is called the one drop rule. Mm-hmm. Where with the one drop rule, where if you had 1 ounce or 1 drop of black blood meaning blood from somebody who is Black, then you were considered to be Black. So if we go back to the NBA players that I mentioned earlier, between Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, well, Klay Thompson has a Black dad from the Bahamas. He's Black like me. Well, wait a minute. Why is Klay Thompson considered biracial? If we were using the one drop rule, he would be considered Black because 1 drop of Black blood means Blackness. But yet we consider him biracial. But yet Steph Curry, who has 2 Black parents, one of them lighter skinned, and Steph's dad is sort of lighter, more caramel colored. He's considered Black, but faces all of the implications of being a lighter skinned Black person. It's crazy how this plays itself out. It's crazy how this plays itself out. Yeah. Another one of these.
What's interesting to me about this, sorry to interject, but
it's okay. What's
interesting is, like, we kind of need to know a little bit more about these people to know their history, because I think that both of these men that we're talking about would be considered Black if we didn't know one of them was biracial. You know what I mean? So I think that there's something to be said about how the sort of the one drop rule has implications for, you know, the real life situations that people enter into. Like, you're considered Black if you kind of look Black. Like, if you know, like if you have a little bit of, you know, 1 drop of blood in you makes you Black, kind of whatever that really means, which is arbitrary. But you know, if you present at all Black, then you're treated a certain way.
Exactly.
Which is something that we're going to talk about in the opposite
later on.
And later on, which I think is also very interesting to think about.
Exactly. Another way that colorism has, where in some instances where you can't necessarily tell based upon skin color if someone is Black or somebody is white, In South Africa, they used a test called the pencil test. The pencil test, because Black people have a certain hair type for the most part, where it's kinky. It looks kind of like this, where if you put a pencil in Michael Jackson's afro, that pencil's not coming out. But if I were to put a pencil in your hair, Catherine, that pencil's falling to the floor and then you got to pick it up. Mm-hmm. So what South Africans did was they put a pencil in people's hair. And if the pencil stayed in your hair, you were considered Black, because Black people's hair was considered to be too kinky and too tightly wrapped and bound for a pencil to not fall out of it. But with white people, if you put a pencil in somebody's hair who's white and it falls out, then it's like, okay, well, yeah, they got to be white, because only Black people have hair that's thick enough and kinky and curly enough to put through, to have the pencil stay in and have it stay there. There's also this sort of hair discussion that, ironically, I'm bringing up because I, strangely enough, actually am clean shaven, so I should be the last person to talk about anything involving hair. But even within these sorts of tropes that we hear about hair, we talk about good hair and bad hair, where we talk about, oh, well, and hell, my daughter's biracial, and I've had people come up to me and my daughter and say, oh, she has really good hair. And it's somewhat straight, but when she puts a little bit of shea butter in it and some of that shea, that there's a hair product called Mixed Chicks, and it just makes her hair really curly. But she has an adopted sister named Zamaya, and Zamaya's parents are Black, and Zamaya has kinky, nappy hair. And for somebody who is quite honestly a racist asshole, they'll look at my daughter and say, oh, she has really good hair. But you know, her adopted sister, her hair is kind of bad. So again, even with my daughter, who has a Black parent and a white parent, who would be, based on the one drop rule, considered Black, and her adopted sister, who has two Black parents, one will be considered to have good hair because her hair is less kinky than her adopted sister. And then because my daughter is biracial and has a lighter skin tone, there's all of the cultural implications of social acceptance that it's more likely to happen with her as opposed to her adopted sister, or to maybe some of my daughter's friends. Because my daughter has Black friends, my daughter also has biracial friends, my daughter also has white friends. And how she moves in, and I know all of her friends, and how she moves in between those friendships and those relationships changes based upon who she's hanging out with. And that's an interesting social dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such an interesting thing to sort of bring to this conversation, because it brings up sort of the beauty standards and stuff that many people, you know, many people around the world are doing things to look more white.
Yes.
And many of these things are things like getting blowouts and things like, you know, wearing wigs so that you can cover up the fact that you have extremely curly hair because of your Black heritage.
Yes.
So that's really interesting that your daughter's hair is framed as quote unquote good hair, because it's more white and less curly and kinky. Yeah. Nappy.
So I'm gonna say less nappy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the implications of that is vast, and we can talk about things like skin lightening creams that are a very big seller in many parts of the world, including
especially in Africa.
Lots and lots in Africa, lots and lots in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and these creams are incredibly toxic.
Yes, they are.
So not only are we talking about processes that people are doing to sort of look lighter in their skin, but they're literally poisoning themselves to do it. And so like the implications of that is just so deeply rooted in white supremacy
Absolutely.
that it's just heartbreaking for me to talk about, because I cannot imagine having or feeling pressure or buying into sort of this idea of having to look a certain way, because you just, that's just the way it is. But
Right.
I say that as
A white woman.
a cisgendered white woman
Correct.
who doesn't shave her armpits, or I present as female, even though I don't buy into sort of the hair removal stuff. And so I think that I just want to sort of call myself out on that, because I've gone through like a very subtle process of going through, the rejection of beauty standards, but other people feel them very deeply, and it's
Sure.
so embedded in our culture that many people feel shame for having darker skin, or having really curly hair, kinky hair, or whatever else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there are plenty of examples of colorism that we've seen throughout society. And as I said earlier on in this conversation, colorism works both ways. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of denying blackness if you are considered to be black or look black is also a real thing. Take, for instance, Tiger Woods. When Tiger
Yes.
Woods started winning all these golf tournaments, Tiger Woods went out and said, hey, I am not black, even though he has a black father and a mother from Thailand. He called himself Cablinasian. What the fuck does that mean?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, because I don't know.
It's supposedly all it's a, oh gosh, it's supposedly a portmanteau of all of the racial categorizations that make up who he is.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody out here actually calls themselves Cablinasian. And when you look at Tiger Woods, it's like, okay, when I look at Tiger Woods, okay, yeah, I can understand how he might look black, but quite honestly, he looks like a darker skinned Asian person. I don't necessarily see him as looking like me. I see him looking like some of my friends that I've spent time with in Thailand, in Bangkok.
Yeah.
So, but yet the space that he occupies and moves in, golf, has been predominantly, almost exclusively a white space. So
Mm-hmm.
anytime you have anybody that looks slightly darker than the standard white person that's on a golf course, and the conventional wisdom would be to think of that person as black. Take for instance, Barack Obama, former President Obama. Barack Obama was called the first black president, but let's be honest, he was biracial. He had a black father from Kenya and a white mother from Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
And quite honestly, if you've read either of his books, The Audacity of Hope or Dreams from My Father, he basically says, you know what, I really didn't grow up around a whole lot of black people. If you remember in with his Ann Dunham, his mother, in his second marriage, she married a gentleman from Indonesia. And Barack Obama has an Indonesian family. And we talked about Southeastern Asia and colorism in Southeastern Asia. We'll talk about that a bit more. So these are two people who, quite honestly, in some instances denied their blackness when it was socially beneficial for them to do so, but used blackness as a shield when necessary because white people were attacking their darker skin and everything that being darker skinned than a white person meant.
Yeah. Yeah, and having to sort of clarify or deny your blackness is also just rooted in white supremacy.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's also privilege in the sense that these two people are not poor.
No, they're not.
They're I mean, maybe I'm not sure of the history of Tiger Woods. I don't know if he grew up poor, but he's definitely not poor now.
No.
And so, yeah, I think that there's also sort of the added layer of socioeconomic status that allows them to occupy these white spaces.
Absolutely.
But they also are denying their Blackness and or justifying it to sort of the critics, as they say, because the culture that we live in just hates Black people.
Correct. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. And it's truthful. And you have situations where, two recent situations where you've had white people use Blackness for their own benefit. For example, Rachel Dolezal, who was a white woman that claimed to be Black. And you have a professor named Jessica Krug, who was a professor at George Washington University that lied about being a Black woman. And she occupied a space at a prominent university in Washington, D.C., where she took up space from other Black people, specifically other Black women. And that sort of situation is insidious. It's terrible. It's horrible. It's disgusting. And when you have white people that take on the identity of Black people or other people of color, and they use that sort of identity to their benefit, that is a form of white privilege.
Yeah.
That is white privilege. That's exactly what it is. It is white privilege. You're taking up space that a Black person should have. You're going somewhere that you really don't need to be going. And it's cultural appropriation, and that sort of reverse colorism is white privilege. And when you have a white person that gets to be or live like a Black person, but doesn't necessarily live the Black experience, like Jessica Krug did at George Washington University, that's so reprehensible. It's so reprehensible, because when you have a situation where somebody's skin color is being used against them, then it makes having these sorts of oppression, these acts of oppression, become more validated, because you have white people that have adopted BIPOC identities and culturally appropriated BIPOCs and used this sort of white privilege against Black people. It's horrible.
Yeah, it's so cringy and disgusting and gross. And I think that, it happens a lot more than these two examples. So I will say that, but these two examples sort of blew up in the news. The Jessica Krug one was a lot more recent.
It was.
And so I think that what you just said is totally accurate. Like, the appropriation involved in these instances where you're taking on Black culture as your own, like, how privileged can you get that you can just take what you want from another culture that is literally oppressed, and you can just do what you want with it? And now this person's going to go on and just live a life as a white woman.
Correct.
Like, this is gross.
Correct.
Your privilege is fucking showing, lady.
Yep.
And oh my goodness. So
it's the disposability of Black culture. Think about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where especially with the Jessica Krug situation, where she can pretend to, and I think she's Jewish, if I'm not mistaken. So she pretended to be a Black woman, yet she's a white Jewish lady. But when people found out that, wait a minute, oh, she's a white lady, a white Jewish lady, she can basically throw away the Blackness that she attached herself to and leave that behind and just go back to being a white Jewish lady without any of the repercussions that Black people have to live with on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. And that colorism or shadism is racism. That sort of colorism or shadism is cultural assimilation. Yeah. She tried to ingratiate herself into Black culture and use Black culture for her benefit. Yeah. But then when Black culture no longer benefited her, she just defaulted to whiteness and left Black culture alone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so disgusting how emboldened it was. And literally that's that's what white supremacy
White
is.
supremacy.
I can
That's
just
exactly
take what
it
I
is.
want and have zero consequences. And the problem that I just get so worked up about is like you're literally taking something from people that are already in pain because of the historical and social structures that already exist. Like you
Correct.
are I sorry, I'm worked up because this is so disgusting to me.
Disgusting. It's
And like,
disgusting.
man, like I am very interested. Like these two people were both professors at universities in um you know,
I don't know if Rachel Dolezal was, but I know
she
Jessica Krug
was
was.
she was she
She
was a
was? Okay.
professor of Africana Studies at Eastern Washington University, and she was also the former regional president of the National Association for the
The advancement
Advancement of
of
Color
color. The
People. So
NAACP.
like, yeah, so like
Okay.
these
I knew
people
that.
are occupying spaces
That Black people should be occupying.
in place. Yes, like these are organizations and universities for Black people, and they should be occupied by Black people. And if you're taking up that space, you're a disgusting human being.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean that's yeah. Sorry.
It's no, it's okay. And again, this is why we have these chats, because there are some conversations that are going to be uncomfortable. And
Yeah,
there's, and I know we got about 15 minutes left or so. Okay.
just less than that, 11.
Okay. 11. Okay. We can keep it moving. I mean,
Yeah.
let's not forget another person, there's another person that has used Blackness and then denied Blackness is current vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not forget, people are saying that Kamala Harris is the first Black and first Eastern Asian person to be vice president. But if you look at Kamala Harris's life and her history, there's really not much Black about her, other than the fact that she's a lot darker skinned than than all other vice presidential candidates,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that she's a woman. Let's take a look at Kamala Harris and how she grew up. And let's first of all take a look at her name, Kamala, not Kamala, but Kamala. Kamala in Sanskrit, which is a Hindu language, means lotus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so even with her name, there's no true identification with Blackness or a Black culture. She went to Howard University. Great. Her mother, who's Indian, is part of the Brahmin culture, in the Brahmin caste system in India. And in Indian culture, the Brahmins are the highest level of the caste system. The Brahmins are typically priests, intellectuals, professors, professionals, etc. Care to guess what Kamala Harris's mother did?
I mean, doctor, lawyer, I don't know.
She has a PhD from Cal Berkeley.
Okay, yeah, no big deal.
No big deal. And she was a biomedical scientist, and she did loads of research with regards to breast cancer.
Mm.
Okay. Kamala Harris she went to school in Canada. Her mother taught at McGill University, another prestigious university, not only in Canada, but around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Kamala Harris's father is a Jamaican. And guess what he did for a living?
I don't know.
Oh gosh, he has a PhD in economics from Cal Berkeley.
Oh,
Again,
wow.
no
Okay.
big deal. And he's a professor emeritus of economics at Stanford.
Mm.
And bear in mind, when her parents divorced, Kamala Harris didn't grow up with her dad, the Jamaican Black dad. She grew up with the Indian mother. Kamala Harris grew up as, quite honestly, an Indian woman with a Black father.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what her heritage is. She went to high school in Canada. She lived with her mother, an Indian woman. But for some inexplicable reason, Black people, and quite honestly, some white people, think that Kamala Harris is the second coming of Claire Huxtable from The Cosby Show. And that's not the case. She grew up as quite honestly, more of an Indian woman. And if you look at many of her policies and what she's done more to harm Black people Yet there's a load of people in society that consider her Black simply because she has a Black parent from Jamaica. Having a Black parent and going to Howard University and pledging in a Black sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha, doesn't make you Black in the traditional sense of a Black American culture. And I posted a video on my Instagram the other day when she says, hey, well, you know what? I'm not going to do something specifically for Black people. Okay? And again, understanding who she is and what she's done in terms of being the top cop in California before she became a state senator, that should tell you everything you need to know about how Kamala Harris identifies with Blackness and being a Black person. She identifies with being a Black person just as much as Tiger Woods identifies with being a Black person.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, both of with Tiger Woods has a Black dad and an Asian mother. With Kamala Harris, she has a Black dad and an Asian, really an Indian mother. So the parallels are obvious. Yeah,
and I think that again, I'll just point out sort of the class issue here, because like, yeah, you're not golfing, growing up golfing if you are poor. You're not becoming, a state senator necessarily when both your parents went to Cal Berkeley.
And both had PhDs.
And with PhDs, exactly. Like this is part of something that I think people should look into with Kamala Harris and really understand, because like class supersedes anything else for the most part, especially in politics in the United States and Canada.
Yes,
and so there's a reason why most people that are upper class, quote unquote, or rich in the true sense of the word, they actually have billions and trillions of dollars. Like, they're white men. There's a reason for that.
The reason for that.
Yeah. So look into it. There are some serious policy implications for this.
It's a real thing.
With this.
It's a real thing. And kind of getting back to the caste system of India, if you look at Kamala Harris's grandfather was a former joint secretary of India.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm going to say that again. A former joint secretary to India. He was a longtime civil servant in India. How do you think that happened? Because Kamala Harris's grandfather was part of that Brahmin caste system. The Brahmin Indian caste system is the highest level on the caste system. That's essentially the American version of being an upper class white person.
Yeah.
That's how Kamala Harris grew up. That was her grandfather. Her mother, PhD from Cal Berkeley, renowned breast cancer researcher. Her father, Jamaican with a PhD in economics. Yeah. And all of a sudden, people think Kamala Harris is Black because she pledged AKA and went to Howard University and HBCU. And again, I'm going to say it again. People all of a sudden think she's the second coming of Claire Huxtable. Stop the bullshit.
Yeah, agreed.
Stop it.
Agreed.
Stop it.
Yeah.
Stop it.
Yeah, I mean, we're running out of time, but I know that we wanted to talk about some other places in the world. I mean, in Southeast Asia, particularly in India and Pakistan, I just sort of went down this I guess, rabbit hole of looking at sort of the, oh my gosh, I'm mincing my words and there's not enough time, but in Bollywood, they show Photoshop actors to appear more white, which is like wild as far as shadism. I mean, they do that to Beyonce and whatever in magazines and videos and stuff too. And I found an article that was talking about how in Bollywood, those who are cast with darker skin are more likely to be vilified or hypersexualized in the part that they're playing, which is also something that has historically happened in the USA with Black women.
Absolutely.
So look into it.
Absolutely. How much time do we have left?
Just over 3 minutes.
Oh, over 3 minutes. Okay. Quick anecdote. I have two friends of mine. One of them has a white American parent and a parent from Thailand. The other has a Chinese parent and a white parent from the United States. Both of them are models in Asia. One lives in and now lives in Hong Kong, and I'm very good friends with him. The other lives in Bangkok, Thailand, and I'm also very good friends with him. Both of them are models. If you looked at both of them, there is no way you would look at either of these people, who I will leave their names out of the discussion. There was no way you would know that either of them had an Asian parent, because quite honestly, they look white.
Yeah.
They look white. And I think because they look white, but close enough to have some sort of Asian phenotypes, it allows them to operate in these high-class Asian modeling spaces because of their slight racial ambiguity,
Mm-hmm.
even though they have a connection to Asian culture because of an Asian parent.
Totally.
It happens.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, at this point, I also want to encourage people to go back to last week's episode on colonialism, because these ideas of how sort of whiteness is touted as the good way to look in sort of beauty centers, these are Eurocentric beauty standards.
Absolutely.
There is a huge number of eyelid surgeries that happen in Asia. That's like the most popular plastic surgery that there is.
Yes.
And it makes your eyes look more white. I mean, people wear visors to block the sun from making their skin darker.
Correct.
And like skin lightening beauty products I mentioned before, like these are widely sold. It's a huge industry because of the Eurocentric beauty standards that come from colonialism and white supremacy.
Absolutely. Kat, I know we're almost out of time. Sands at the bottom of the hourglass.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, as usual.
Yeah. We're going to talk about white people getting tans and all of that, but we'll save that for another day.
Yeah, we can chat about that another time. But I just wanted to mention, sort of in closing, that internalized white supremacy is, like I just said, sort of this legacy of colonialism. Like, it comes from that, and so we're all part of it, and we're all perpetuating it. So I just want to encourage everybody to look inward. And we've all been sort of on this journey of racial justice work, this summer and up till now. And I really hope that all the white people listening are still on that journey of learning and becoming anti-racist, because these things have deeply rooted internalizations within us, and we need to address it, whether it's in me or you, whatever shade you are.
Exactly. These internalizations are habitual, and we will talk about the power of habit and anti-racism in a future episode, and we're going to figure out how to change your habits to become anti-racist. We'll talk about that in a future episode.
Yeah. So Joe, thank you so much.
Very welcome, as always.
Always a pleasure.
It's always mine. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. And sharing is caring. We do this because we care. Everyone out there, please go watch all the previous episodes. They're great.
Binge watch them all night.
Awesome.
All right.
Take care.
Peace.